Hello, and welcome back to another Lake Org chat. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Director of Extension Lakes. We're doing these chats basically to help people stay up to speed with what's going on with lake organizations in the state of Wisconsin, covering a range of topics that you can see on the slide. The idea is to try to break this down for people who maybe want to get information through video or audio means. So just one other way to access resources that we have at Extension Lakes here at the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point. Today we're going to be talking about a fairly specific topic, but it's one that does come up time and again, and it's about creating or changing the boundaries for lake districts. And really, we're going to focus mostly on creating those boundaries when a group is looking to form a lake district. And as Director of Extension Lakes, I field a lot of questions from lake associations or just citizens thinking about forming a lake district. And one of their questions is always, what should the boundaries look like? And I'm joined today by William O'Connor, or Bill O'Connor. Bill is with Boardman Clark Law in Madison, Wisconsin, and has a long history of educating people and thinking about and even litigating in some cases around lake districts and how they operate in the state of Wisconsin. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation, Eric.
All right. Part of what we still see in Wisconsin is people forming new lake districts. And this is kind of unique because we have local governments in Wisconsin. We have towns, cities, villages. And for the most part, a lot of them are fairly stable. We don't see a lot of new towns being formed, for example. We don't even see too many new school districts being formed, but lake districts are being formed on the regular. Maybe about 5 new lake districts per year being developed to solve problems collectively around lake management. And that's really what Chapter 33 in the original Lake District Law that's now 50 years old was about. And what I wanted to share on this slide is just really a simple recipe for forming a lake district. Just a couple of, it's really a simplification of the process, taking you through it. I'm not going to read each number here, but all of these steps are really informed by state statute. A lake district is a local unit of government, and as such, it really does have to fall in line with what the state of Wisconsin as a government sets as parameters or sideboards for how they both come into being and then how they operate. So these all have reference in statute. We're not going to dive too deep into those, but bear in mind, if you wanted to get more into this, we do have still the guide online called People of the Lakes. And Bill, you had a role to play in creating that guide, right? The People of the Lakes document is actually the evolution of an earlier document.
Yes, I was privileged to work on the development of that. I don't know how many years ago that's been now, Eric, but I know that that's been a very important resource for people, both in the creation of new lake districts and in the operation of existing lake districts. When we work with communities to establish lake districts, we're pretty quick at providing them with a copy of People of the Lakes because it's such a useful reference.
And that is where you'll find sort of the specific references back to state statute to tell you exactly where the law says that it has to be done in a certain way. So this is just really a boiled down summary of that process. And it kind of assumes also this is a lot of lake districts form in rural areas, and they submit a petition to a county. So number 6 refers to a county. Number 4 refers to a county. County governments are sort of these local branches of the state of Wisconsin, 72 of them in the state of Wisconsin. Some of them have many, many lakes, and some of them have very few. But the county for most organizations is sort of their partner, and it's going to be the county that brings this lake district into existence. I highlighted these 2 steps, number 3 and 4, because those are the ones we're going to talk about today, and because 3 and 4 are actually related. The number of signatures you need is sort of a function of how big of a boundary did you draw, and expanding and contracting your boundary can either make your life easier or harder as you go about the task of collecting signatures. So boundaries and signatures and sort of indicating how much support there is for the formation of a new lake district, those things are intricately related.
Yeah, the only comment that I would make is in figuring out the boundary of a lake district, some are created on relatively small lakes that are within a single township. And where that occurs, there's an option in state law to have the decision maker that handles the consideration of a petition and actually makes the determination as to whether to create a lake district. It can be done by the town board as opposed by the county board if the proposed boundary is entirely within the jurisdiction of a single town.
Yes. And in that case, sort of wherever you see county mentioned here, town and town board would replace that reference to county. And some of the reasons why people would do that, sometimes, believe it or not, the town is actually more sort of amenable and more interested in seeing the Lake District come into being than potentially the county is. Oftentimes those have to do with sort of political understandings of what a taxing jurisdiction is going to be all about and what they're going to do. And sometimes it could be that the people in the town board actually know very well the issues that are taking place on that lake and have been historically very involved in that lake. The downside is that the town may not have the resources to be tremendously helpful. That particularly when it comes to accessing parcel data from, say, the county tax records itself, the town might say, well, we don't really have a person to help you do that. Most towns in Wisconsin are fairly low in terms of capacity. But certainly it is an option when you're proposing a lake district that's solely within a town. You get to choose to either work with the town or the county.
And I think it should be said also that, Eric, even where the town is proceeding, we have over the last 20 years in Wisconsin been very successful at advancing the sophistication of digital land records. And so pretty much every county has a pretty darn good system for tracking parcels of real estate. And so the information that you need to determine where boundaries might be drawn and to help you assess and estimate the number of signatures you're going to require on a petition will certainly, you're certainly going to want to interact with the county land information staff to assist, whether this is done at the county or whether it's done at the town.
Yes.
They're
Yes.
partners.
And in an ideal world too, the town and the county and all the staff all get along and there's no
Right.
issues to tapping into those resources. Now, the statute itself has only a couple of comments or statements about those boundaries, which is a little bit surprising. It's a consequential decision, who's in and who's out. But the limitations really are these two bullet points. The district may only include territory found to be benefited by the establishment of the district, and you can't include any territory that's part of a city or a village, otherwise known as incorporated, without the approval of the city council or village board. We're going to talk in a little bit about what this, on that first bullet point where it says found to be benefited. But Bill, I think there's this idea that, like, if a group gets together or volunteers and they say, well, this is the boundary, we believe these people are going to benefit, like, should someone challenge that right away and say, I think you're wrong. I think you got these boundaries wrong. How do we characterize even this process of the initial process of saying, we think this area is going to benefit?
Well, benefit is the key word in the world of Lake District boundaries. It's the essential concept. And it is essential. It's not a term that is easy to define. And my own sense is that the legislature has established this term benefited because it's too hard to write down the type of if and then statements that you might use if you were trying to be more precise in establishing that. From a lawyerly point of view, I think what this reflects is that when the county board or the town board makes the decision to create a lake district, they are required to make the finding that the property within the proposed boundary will be benefited. And essentially what that means is that that town board or county board are acting in a legislative capacity, and they're making what is essentially a political decision. It isn't a hard matter of fact that property is benefited. It's a property is benefited if the decision maker believes that it's benefited. And they could take into account many factors in coming to that realization. But I think it was a wise decision for the legislature to do this. The Lake District law was written by photocopying an earlier law that enabled the formation of town sanitary districts. And essentially, they took the town sanitary district statute and cut and paste and revised it a little bit. But there's a huge amount of overlap between the structure of the law that permits the formation of town sanitary districts and the law that permits lake districts. And going all the way back to the 1940s, when town sanitary districts were first enabled, it went back, that was the term that was used, that the property that would be included in the boundary had to be benefited by inclusion in the district.
We have some further tips, I guess, in People of the Lakes too. These are just you'll find this in the guide, suggested lands for inclusion. And each bullet point kind of has a talking point here, but it says start with riparian parcels because they are the most directly benefited from the lake. Some other sort of rules here: don't try and cut a parcel in half. You really need to stick to the parcels that exist on the landscape, and we'll show some examples of what parcels look like. This third point, again, include parcels which are not on the lake, but their use is assumed to be benefited by being close to the lake. So right across the road, for example, there might be a motel or a hotel, or adjacent to the lake, there could be a marina. Take a look at maps, and we'll play around with that in a second here. If there's a sewer or water utility, this kind of gets back to what you were saying, Bill, about sanitary district law. Sewer and water utilities was sort of what sanitary districts were setting up. And if you envision this happening, then think about where that service is going to be extended to and include that. Last one's a little bit nice, but it's easy to say, harder to do. If a property has deeded access, or if there's a lot that provides shared access to the lake to a number of off-lake properties, it would make sense to include them as well. The riparian ring is sort of that jumping off point. And when the law was being drafted, this is kind of initially what they thought would only be allowed, would be to stick to the riparian ring. And even there, some people say, well, wait a minute, though, there's some properties here that don't have a house on it. You know, should they be included? And I would argue, yeah, this boundary is meant to sort of stand the test of time. It's not meant to be sort of a temporary, it's one thing one day and it's going to change just because someone built a house the next. Instead, include those undeveloped or unimproved properties that are in that riparian ring. It's not common to find a riparian ring that sort of is jigsaw puzzled in and out of a lake district. Instead, it's kind of presumed that riparian properties would stand, like it says, benefit most directly from the lake district itself. Similarly, if there's county forest land, for example, on the lake, or other local government land, I'm not sure you necessarily want to skip over that. Local governments can dispose of property just as well as they can acquire property. And so what's county forest today or county land today or town land today could very well be in the future privately held and would be similar to all the other properties. So I think that contiguous ring around the lake makes sense to start with. And then the question becomes getting off of the lake, going out into non-riparian property. So when you're going non-riparian, when you're getting past that ring, those three final points here, bullet points, are the ones you would try to use as you're assessing how to draw these boundaries. Any other comments about riparian versus non-riparian, Bill?
Well, as you mentioned, Eric, the original drafts of the Lake District law provided for the formation of lake districts that included property that had frontage on the lake. In other words, riparian property. As the markup continued through committee process and so on, and hearings in the legislature, they broadened it out to include this more generalized concept of benefit. But you're right. I mean, the heart and soul is the riparian property. And in my judgment, every lake district should include the entire, as you say, ring of riparian property around the lake. In some cases, there are good reasons under your points 2, 3, and 4, or 3, 4, and 5, to go a little further, because there are parcels that aren't on the water, but that obviously benefit from the condition of the lake and therefore the creation of the Lake District. So, and part of this is just political. The further you get from the water, the less enthusiastic the property owners are likely to be about the prospects for improvement in lake management and potentially the enhancement of property values, the further you get from the waterfront. And so you're more likely to have people show up at your public hearing objecting who do not personally feel that their property will be benefited. And the group that is the least likely to contest or question whether their property will be benefited are the riparian property owners, the waterfront property owners, the people with the piers and boats.
Yep. So this slide kind of reiterates that, and this is some language again from People of the Lakes. That larger district, you might even have a harder time organizing it, getting the signatures needed. As you expand outward from the riparian ring, all those additional landowners become possible people who will sign the petition, but they also become possible people who don't sign the petition. And as you add more people who don't sign the petition, you're making it harder and harder to get that majority support that you would need in order to actually form the district. So when the smaller district, riparian ring, for example, a lot easier to organize, but then you're focusing like those are the only people that are going to have a seat at the table. They're the only people that are going to be contributing financially really to the operation of the Lake District. So your odds change about getting 50% as you go further out. And then also as you get further out, those people, if you included them in your boundaries, they're still then eligible to participate in your annual meeting. They're able to vote on commissioners, and they're also able to vote on your budget. And so the further out you go, the more likely you might get people who show up at your meeting and want to zero out your budget. And so I just want to comment, we know of one lake district that existed in the state of Wisconsin. They drew their boundaries really large. So this is around the city of New Richmond in western Wisconsin. And if you can look on this map, let me bring this. This is the map showing the Lake District boundary. And if the boundary followed this dark blue line, the star is showing where the city of New Richmond is. And they wanted to deal sort of with their watershed. You can see the riverways feeding into an impoundment in the village, but they also included properties downstream. These are entire towns. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of acres of land included into their boundaries. And at one of their early meetings, many farmers from out in that landscape showed up at the annual meeting, and they all collectively voted no on the budget. They didn't want to see any money levied to take on the challenges of the water body. And after that took place, the Lake District Board never brought forward another budget that included taxing people in this ginormous district. And this is the only district I know of that has actually gone through, I think, the really required steps to formally dissolve or end the Lake District. Just in 2023, they formally voted at an annual meeting to say, we're done. So this is just one kind of extreme example of how it can come back to haunt you if you kind of go too big. If you extend those boundaries out too far, it's going to make your work actually potentially much more challenging.
And there's always been a logic in going further into the watershed from the riparian ring, Eric. Lakes are deep. We don't generally have lake pollution that results from discharges from industries or wastewater treatment plants. The primary pollutant that affects inland lake districts in Wisconsin is runoff. It's all landscape based. And that means that a lake district has a real interest in how property is managed that was within the watershed, where rainwater will run through that property and get into the lake. And so the idea of having a district that's, vaguely like your Upper Willow map, it's not an insensible idea.
Right. I think another thing though people ask too, this is a good related question. Can the Lake District do things outside of the boundary? Can they go up and work with the landowner outside up in the watershed and say, hey, we want to fund a project on your land that's going to benefit our lake? My understanding is that they can totally do that. There's no limit really on where they spend their money or their time and energy. And if going outside of the formal Lake District boundaries where the biggest kind of impact is going to be, of course, we'd encourage them to go out into the watershed and expend their resources.
I don't think we've had a court decision that says anything directly about this, but in my opinion, I don't think there's much doubt that a lake district can lawfully spend money outside of its boundary in order to take actions for the benefit of the protection or rehabilitation of a lake.
Yeah. So the biggest thing is that you can't force those people outside the boundary to pay for it.
That's
They're
right.
not part of the taxing body of the Lake District, the taxing area. But you can certainly go up there in the watershed and take care of challenges.
That's right.
So we come back to this idea of benefiting too, and you've already hinted at it, that at the time of the petition, it's sort of this legislative process. But in the case of these farmers outside of New Richmond, some of them, like someone living way out here, or even someone further downstream, closer to Hudson, Wisconsin, might say, hey, I want to get out of this lake district. That same modification to the statute that allowed lake districts to be formed that included non-riparian property added a clause to the statute that said there's a way out, that you can request to be detached, right?
That's right. The Lake District law from the beginning has had provisions that deal with the potential to modify the boundary after the Lake District is created. Property can be attached under certain circumstances, and property can be detached. Property that's can be detached by the Board of Commissioners of a Lake District if they determine that the property is not benefited by continued inclusion in the Lake District. And a property owner can petition the Lake District Board to detach their property if they believe that their property is no longer benefited by inclusion in the district. There's been a very significant change in the law on this topic since the Donaldson versus the Rock-Koshkonong Lake District decision was handed down by the Supreme Court. I was involved in that because I represented the Rock-Koshkonong Lake District. And what happened in that case, Eric, I don't know, is this a good time to wade into this?
Perfect.
What happened in that case is that there was a property owner within the district who owned two very, very small parcels of land. They were actually parcels that were less than 1/10 of an acre, and they were used for the erection of billboards facing the highway. And the owner of those properties, a Las Vegas, Nevada resident named Arthur Donaldson, believed that those parcels did not benefit from inclusion in the Lake District. They had been included in the Lake District when it was established by the county board some years before. The Lake District took the position, which I believe was consistent with Wisconsin law at the time, that once the county board has made the determination that the property to be included within a proposed district is benefited, that means that decision has been made. There's been a legislative determination that all of the property within a set boundary is benefited. And therefore, if you seek to remove your property from the Lake District, you have to have a reason for it. And the reason needs to be based on the fact that something changed. There was a change in circumstances since the county board made the formal finding that all the property within the proposed boundary will be benefited. Mr. Donaldson, in the course of the proceedings that were conducted by the Rock-Koshkonong Lake District Board, conceded that there had not been any change since the county board had made the determination, but still he wanted out. And that goes back to cases that happened up in the lower Fox Valley where Fort Howard Paper Company was property owned by the paper company was included within a sanitary district boundary. And in that case, the paper company said, we already have our own treatment system, and therefore we don't need to be included within a district that may be putting in a sewer and water system. And in that case, the court, the Wisconsin Supreme Court eventually ruled that the determination to what property is benefited is made by looking at the proposed district as a whole. It isn't based on looking individually at each little parcel within a boundary. It's based on the overall concept. And so that was the rule. And in what happened ultimately in the Rock-Koshkonong case is that the Lake District defended its denial of Mr. Donaldson's petition to detach his property. That went to the circuit court down in Rock County. The Rock County Circuit Court agreed with the Lake District that because there had been no change in circumstances, there was no basis to essentially overturn the county board's determination that it was all the property was benefited. Mr. Donaldson appealed it to the Wisconsin Court of Appeals. There was a significant appellate court case that went on about that. And following that, a 3-judge panel of the Wisconsin Court of Appeals affirmed what the lower court said, which affirmed what the Lake District's action was, holding that, that since there had been no change in the circumstances, that the Lake District properly denied the petition. When it got to the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, things changed. In that case, Mr. Justice Prosser wrote a very lengthy, complicated, I would say hard to read decision that looked at it in a different way. And essentially, the court ruled in the Donaldson case that the initial determination to include property within a Lake District boundary is a legislative decision, and that the legislative body, whether it's the town board or the county board, as we have discussed, is entitled to look at the entire boundary of the district and determine whether, as a whole, that property will be benefited from inclusion at the Lake District. But essentially, the court said that's just the first step. If after the Lake District is created, a landowner believes that their particular parcel is not benefited, that then benefit has a different meaning. I was quite surprised at the court's determination on that, because the lower courts, the Court of Appeals, and the prior case law was all pretty clear that the word benefit means the same thing in the 2 different places in Chapter 33 where it is used, and that the standard for benefit would be the same. But Wisconsin law now is not consistent with that view, and recognizes that benefit in the formation of a Lake District is a more generalized legislative idea, but that a challenge to continued benefit after the district in form is based on a different standard.
Yeah, and I think you've commented and other people have tried to analyze it and say, in that second case, when someone's seeking to be detached from the district, it does make sense for the district board to have some sort of process that they're going to walk the landowner through, that they don't just say, what do you guys think? Yes or no, and then take a vote and either accept or deny it, but instead treat it like a serious request and try and document what exactly is going on here.
Yeah, that's right. And in the case of that Rock-Koshkonong, and we've handled this with other lake districts too, they had already adopted a formal policy for how they would handle any petition for attachment or detachment. In other words, if somebody came to the Lake District and proposed to either remove property or add property, they set up a process. And the process included, a requirement that the petition be submitted by the property owner who seeks the change, whether to add or detract. And in that request for detachment or attachment, the property owner is, called upon to state why. What is the reason that you believe the property would be benefited by addition or not benefited by inclusion and therefore should be detached from the Lake District. And then under the process that was established by the Lake District Board at Rock-Koshkonong, they set up a procedure where there would be a public hearing. And they even had the timing, depending on when the petition was filed in connection with the next meeting of the Lake District, there would be a public hearing. At the public hearing, the person seeking detachment would go first. They would present their request or petition, if you want, to detach the property, and they would explain their reasons why. They would provide whatever evidence they wish to submit in support of their request. And then anybody else who wishes to testify could also testify. And so by the time the Rock-Koshkonong case got to the district court on the challenge, there was already a pretty good record that had been established. In fact, there was a videotape made before that became common as dirt of the public hearing. And so the court had access to an actual recorded video of the public hearing, and they could see exactly what the information was that the commissioners based their decision on.
So when we talk about at the time of petition, this concept of benefiting, it seems as though we're saying that's a legislative decision. And then this other process at the time of detachment, what's a label we'd attach to that? How do we call that process?
I guess that's a quasi-judicial decision.
Sure. So quasi-judicial sounds kind of fancy, but it has to do with lots of local government decisions that don't quite match just the lawmaking body or the governing body determining something as like these properties will generally benefit, but it has to do with, like you said, some sort of hearing where there's maybe evidence or testimony provided, and then sort of using quasi-judicial judgment, and then that decision is appealable to a court. And you'd say, well, let's bring the record from how that decision was made into the court.
And one of the important lawyerly distinctions is that when courts review legislative decisions, like the decision of a county board to form a lake district with the boundaries that were proposed or the boundaries that the county determined to adopt at the time that they issued the order creating the lake district, if a court reviews that, the standard of review, as lawyers say, what is the standard by which the judge reviews that? And the standard of review for a legislative decision is very low. In other words, the court is required to affirm the legislative determination unless it is arbitrary and capricious or unsupported by the evidence or contrary to law. They can't overturn the judgment of what is benefited by inclusion in the Lake District when it is formed based on the judge having a little different idea of what he thinks benefit means. Instead, he has to defer to the legislative decision that was made by the county board or the town board and is required to affirm it unless it meets one of those standards. It's arbitrary and capricious, it's not supported by evidence, or it's not lawfully incorrect. They didn't proceed according to law.
And then the standard is sort of different than if it's the later decision about detachment.
In that case, the courts have greater authority to, it's a stricter scrutiny.
Sure, stricter scrutiny.
That's right.
Requirement. So again, try not to get too hung up in these, but realize that a way to think about this is that just because you get these initial boundaries set up, and I've even said, like, you want these to stand the test of time, the legislature provided this relief valve, this way that a person could request to be detached, and you just need to deal with that when it comes on. But that's usually something that the Lake District Board would do in its course of operations.
And I certainly would recommend that any lake district adopt a formal policy for how they will handle requests or petitions to detach or attach property in advance. It's
Yeah.
better to think it through, have a policy, have a procedure, and then apply it if there is an application, a petition, rather than having to figure out what to do at the time it lands.
And we'll link to some resources on the video to help you find maybe what a policy looks like, or find a description, another description really of the Donaldson case. Now I want to just sort of kind of help us close out by looking at some examples too, because we've been talking about these things that really are map based, right? A lot of this has to do with looking at a map and understanding the uniqueness of each lake and what's going on around it. And fortunately, Polk County government has provided some online maps showing what the Lake District boundaries look like, and even showing sort of what year they were established. So this is the White Ash Lake in Polk County. To me, this is a pretty standard example of, this is pretty much riparian property. The blue line here is meant to show, actually, it says a town resolution. So to me, that indicates, as Bill said earlier, a town board can cause this lake district to come to existence. I'm going to then know that this whole North White Ash Lake and White Ash Lake are both within the same town. So a town passed this back in 1976, and they stuck pretty much with the riparian ring. They didn't really go out of their way to pick up properties like out here in maybe what would be called the watershed. There's a river here, the Apple River, coming in and leaving. They didn't go all the way up the Apple River and say, let's get more property in that way. There are some distinctions on this map that if I had time, I'd go talk to the people in Polk County, because there's some orange properties that show up here that here it says these are parcels in the district, but they don't necessarily coincide with the boundary that was created. So I'm not sure what the history is behind that, but this is a relatively clean map showing these boundaries. I'd also point out there's a little white riparian property here, kind of on North White Ash Lake. Looks like it's a road right of way that comes right into the lake. I would like to assume that that's going to always be road right of way, but it's not clear. 100 years from now, conditions could change. So my advice would have been, just include it anyway, because if you're including all riparian property, then go with all riparian property.
And just observing on that map, Eric, my eyes aren't good enough to see that map in enough detail, but it looks like on the very north end that the boundary hugs the shore, and that there are a couple riparian properties that are not included within the Lake District. And I wonder if that's a town line.
Yeah, probably.
If those were excluded because they were outside the jurisdiction of the town. So if they'd gone to the county, they could have included those parcels on the North Shore. But since it was done by the town, it was beyond their jurisdiction, possibly.
Sure. Yep. And again, if those people, like, here's another point to raise. It's a double-edged sword. Not being included in the Lake District means you don't get a tax bill associated with what the Lake District is doing, but it also means you don't get a say in what the Lake District is doing. If you're not in the boundary, you don't get to participate in the annual meeting. You don't get to vote on commissioners, and you don't get to vote on that budget. So there's actually a case to be made for these property owners. If they want to participate, they can petition the Lake District Board and say, you know what, we'd like to be brought in now to this Lake District. It might be beyond our conversation, but it's not clear to me if that means that would have to go to a county board decision, because now it is a multi-municipal Lake District, or if the existing Lake District Board can just say, we're holding a hearing or you petitioned us, you want to be in, we're good, you're in. Here's another example of going a little bit bigger, right? So this is Largon Lake, also in Polk County. This one here, it says this was a county resolution plus detachment. So something has happened historically to detach properties from this district, established again way back in the early days of the Lake District law. And here, you can see that they clearly included non-riparian lands, these farmlands, but maybe I would say it's not excessive. It doesn't go way out into the watershed. These are the properties. There's properties in the middle here where there's clearly off-lake property that is much smaller parcels than the surrounding countryside. All around this lake, it looks like nothing's been divided much smaller than the surveyed 40 acres. But right in the middle here, you've got a bunch of small lots. And to me, usually when I look at something and say, well, those small lots, the only reason someone would carve, you have to pay money to get these small lots. You have to register a new, you have to record a new survey with the
Plat, yeah.
county to get these things. So there's an expense to that. The only reason you do that is if it made sense. Like, oh, you know, we're going to put a shed over there, or we're going to sell it to somebody else. There's going to be deeded access. Wherever I see this pattern of development, these smaller lots, I'd say, well, if not for the lake's existence, those small lots probably wouldn't be there either, given the fact that all around there it's just 40s. So to me, these boundaries make a lot of sense. This one, bring this one up. Bill probably can't see this on his screen, but this is the Rock-Koshkonong, the one we were talking about earlier. And to me, this captures a couple of different things that we've been talking about. It's both riparian properties and non-riparian properties. This lake district really cuts across 3 counties, Jefferson, Dane, and Rock County, with the highest valuation being in Rock County. There's an entire, you almost can't see it on this map because we're zoomed out so far, but there's clusters of hundreds and hundreds of parcels down here, just on the north end of the Rock County line. A lot of people might be familiar with this area. If you've ever driven from Madison down to the Chicago area, you probably cross the Rock River at really Lake Koshkonong, because the dam is down here where the star is. The reason I put the star on the map is to show that the dam is way downstream. It affects this water body all the way upstream. And really, if you're way up here in the northern end and these red parcels past Fort Atkinson, you could hop in a pontoon boat, float all the way down, float through Fort Atkinson, get out onto Lake Koshkonong, do some fishing or whatever, head down to this area, tie up to a pier, go to a tavern, go down even further, check out the dam, and then come back up. You could spend a whole day probably boating on this very large water body. And so they have a very large tax base that they're pulling from. I'm sure this makes their annual meetings complicated because there literally could be thousands of people who could show up to a Lake District annual meeting here. They excluded or skipped over the city of Fort Atkinson. And this gets at the point we raised earlier that cities and villages can say no. The village board or the city council has to be, they have to willingly go along with the district, right?
Well, they have to permit petitioning within their boundaries.
Yes, and they can kind of veto it. They could say, well, we don't want
No
it.
petitioning. Yep, that's right.
Yep. And Bill and I talked a little bit about this, that this is sort of a power that we grant to municipalities in state law in Wisconsin that generally say, like, municipalities are incorporated. They have more capacity to manage these things, whereas the towns are always thought of as sort of units of counties and units of the state. And so you had mentioned, Bill, too, that this law was copied off of sanitary district law. And so many cities already have their own sanitary systems. They didn't need neighboring towns or other people coming in and competing. That's maybe like the Fort Howard case you were talking about too. I'm sure there's lots of interesting maps about sanitary district boundaries and municipal boundaries in the Fox Valley area. But cities are basically granted this greater authority to say, no, we don't want our property included in your lake district. If they wanted to, they could start thinking, like the people, again, who live on the water body in Fort Atkinson, yay, they do not have to pay the taxes, but also they don't get to participate in decision making.
And there have been some. We were recently involved, I don't know, it was maybe 4 years ago, a very large lake district was created at Beaver Dam Lake in Dodge County. Yes. And I think that one includes territory in 5 townships, but it also includes territory in the city of Beaver Dam.
Yes.
And so the city of Beaver Dam accepted the idea that some of its citizens would be paying taxes to support a public inland lake district in addition to the unincorporated area parcels.
Right. And they would be paying, sort of, the city people often say, like, I'm taxed enough already, why are you adding another tax to me? But in that case too, in Dodge County, a lot of those riparian properties within the city, they were just like any other riparian property. They had piers and homes built right on the lake. So it kind of made sense that they really did stand to benefit by water quality improvements that the Lake District was hoping to achieve or managing Eurasian water milfoil. So I think, but you're right that I think historically that the groups around Beaver Dam had tried to get a Lake District going, and most of the past attempts in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, even the early 2000s, I think they tried again. The city was usually not on board, and that sort of made everyone feel like, well, if we're not all in, then let's not do this. But as this example shows, you don't really need those city properties to be included. For the purposes of feeling fair, it might make sense, but the law doesn't require it.
Yeah, and I think, just commenting a little further on Beaver Dam and the illustration it makes about your recipe for forming a lake district, the simple steps. Leadership matters. And in the case of the Beaver Dam Lake District, there was a close relationship between the people who were promoting the Lake District and a very well-developed lake association, the Beaver Dam Lake Improvement Association. They worked hand in glove, and there were the leadership of the team that worked on forming that lake district were very effective communicators. They were very good about explaining to property owners what they were doing and why they were doing it. And really, I think that made all the difference in the world.
Yeah, no, I can see that. We saw that just in the people that we interacted with too. We had lots of conversations, and myself and Mike Engelson from Wisconsin Lakes went out and gave presentations. We really tried to make sure people understood what's going on here.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you joining me, Bill, today to talk about these questions around boundaries. I hope people will find this useful. Obviously, the people that this is really geared towards, anybody contemplating the process of getting started, and your final points there about leadership matters and starting with a good team of people to help out. I think those are points well made. So thank you for that. And in fact, next month in August, we're going to talk about membership. From our perspective at Extension Lakes, membership has to do with sort of that core body of support, usually for a lake association where membership is sort of optional. What do you do as a lake association to cultivate strong membership and to make sure that you have community support for the things that you're doing? So join us again next month. I just want to thank Bill again for hanging out today for our Lake Board chat. And really thank you, Bill, for all you've done. I think you've done tremendous work helping lake districts all around the state of Wisconsin. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure to visit with you about this, and I hope that our conversation is of some use to people. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.